Hi, this is Lili Sanderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. Thanks so much for joining me today with the beginning of the Doctrine and Covenants. I did take a week off and hope you all had peace and some joy during the holidays. It was a new experience to go through them without Chris. Actually, as you may know, I lost Chris just before Christmas last year. And so I guess this is technically the second Christmas that I experienced without him. But the first time, honestly, I'm sure there was some shock involved. This time, I didn't feel that quite the same way. And my kids were great. And I'm really grateful for them. I'm grateful for neighbors and friends and some of you amazing podcast listeners who reached out with kindness and love and I know prayers. And I am grateful for the gifts that were given, verbal or otherwise. Really, I'm astonished at the goodness of people. I shouldn't be, because I do believe that there are great people in the world. And I know that some of them are listening to this podcast, and I'm super grateful for that. But brothers and sisters, I was still astonished at the thoughtfulness and the effort that people went to express love or drop by something, often anonymously or with a note that was incredibly touching. And I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful, and I want you to know that. I know there are people out there around us that are more deserving, I'm sure, and I just really appreciate the thoughtfulness and kindness that was extended again and again to me during this time. And I was going to mention that, not to be a downer, but I did attend my dear friend Grace's funeral just a month or so ago, and at that time I saw one of Grace's cousins that I have known for a while, a really wonderful person, and she lost her husband a few years back and told me that it's the first 2 years that are really hard. I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not sure that I am geared up to hear that, but for those of you who are also grieving or have grieved in the past, honestly, it probably doesn't end. I've had some dear friends that have helped to sustain me this year. I've been through the loss of a spouse, and it's true that grieving doesn't seem to end for anybody. I think that this is what can make, if we work it right, make our hope in the resurrection more immediate and more fervent in our lives, more full. Because that will be the end of grief. That will be a time of incredible completion and rejoicing. And I'm so grateful for what we know about eternal life and everlasting life and the family going on beyond this world. And I do have a testimony of those things. I think I've always had a testimony of those things growing up in the church, but I certainly can see layers of growth in understanding over the years and more sure and more firm reliance on those things. And it fills me with gratitude that these promises are made to us repeatedly in our covenants and in the scriptures, through the words of the prophets. It's astounding how much assurance there is in all of the words that we hear in the gospel of Jesus Christ, in the good news of the gospel. And of course, that is the meaning of the word gospel, is good news. Waiting is hard. Waiting is hard. Again, I've mentioned this before, but President Nelson has said, and he's not the first one who has suggested this, of course, that this life passes like a nanosecond. And yet some years, some days, some hours are longer than others. And I love that thought, and I look forward to feeling more of that. Now that our prophet is past the 100-year mark, the century mark, which is astonishing to see him past that century threshold, still with a sharp and bright mind and a desire to express his love and his prophetic voice to all of us. At any rate, maybe at that stage, everything does seem like it's been a nanosecond. I don't know. I'm sure he went through his long years too, and he's talked about some of those things that he's experienced in life that have been hard. Well, let me wish you a happy new year as we get going here, and thank the Patreon subscribers again that support this podcast. Brothers and sisters, I could not do this without that support. I'm extremely grateful for those of you who have been able to subscribe on Patreon. And again, thanks for your patience, because this holiday time has been a little challenging and I've taken a little time off to just let myself grieve and go through this. And so I will be catching up. By the time this episode comes out, there will be some catch up on Patreon. And if you're able to subscribe and support the podcast, the link is below in the description. And again, thank you to all of those of you who have subscribed. I am forever grateful that allows me to continue to bring this content to you. I feel like I'm talking really slowly today, and I think I had a crash after the holidays and still kind of waiting to get that limited energy back to where it was. So maybe I'll warm up as we go along. A little bit of current events, and there have been so many things going on. This is certainly kind of random that I landed on these things, but I decided to land on these things, so here we go. This is a follow-up. I've talked before about Daniel Penny, that former Marine who was on trial and finally acquitted of all charges by a New York jury because he leapt to the defense of some subway fellow travelers in the car that he was in as someone who was high on drugs and had other mental health issues, seemed to be in the middle of a schizophrenic episode. But whatever was going on, he was doing some really threatening talk and saying someone was going to die that day, and he looked pretty menacing. And Daniel Penny leapt to the defense of his fellow travelers and subdued the man who was threatening, Jordan Neely, who ended up dying. But there were multiple reasons why he could have succumbed at that time, and yet even in spite of those things, Daniel Penny was charged and had to go through a trial. And even after the jury dismissed one charge, or was a hung jury for one charge, they asked them to work on another charge, and that apparently isn't even normal legal procedure. Don't ask me, I'm not an expert, but the point is, he was acquitted of all charges. Now, what's so fascinating, well, there are lots of fascinating things about this, the world we're in right now, and how good has been called evil and evil good. And to bear that out, let's juxtapose that with another story that has been reported kind of similarly, because it happened at the time the jury was still out, I believe, or shortly after. A man named Luigi Mangione came to New York City also, and obviously with premeditation. I mean, it looked like he was stalking the guy, or at least he was aware of the CEO of United Healthcare coming out of a hotel, and he was waiting for him and shot him in the back, and shot him a few times until that CEO was killed. And what's been so tragic here, of course, in addition to the loss of this innocent man who was the father of a couple of kids at least, was that there's been a public response to this shooting, again, cold-blooded, in the back, on the streets of New York City during the day. There's been this kind of support that has emerged for the suspected killer, who is now arrested and being held, and I guess will stand trial. But the point is that they've started a GoFundMe for this Mr. Mangione, and he's a relatively young guy. He's a Princeton grad, and there's been this outcry of support, and not just from the populace, but also from even some political figures or people in the public sphere. And it's, again, Isaiah warned us of this a long time ago. What's so fascinating is we thought we had seen it for years now, and we have, but it seems like it's getting more and more obvious and more severe that good is called evil and evil called good. I mean, to levels of extremity, because one poll recently showed that 41%, like, think about this, 41% of 18 to 29-year-olds reported that they thought the shooting of the CEO in cold blood in the back was acceptable. 41% of 18 to 29-year-old registered voters. Breaking that down a little bit, about 24% found it somewhat acceptable, and 17% found it completely acceptable. So that's where they get the 41%. Those that found it either somewhat or completely acceptable. 41% of 18 to 29-year-olds. Now, this is terrible. Brothers and sisters, this is terrible. And, I know sometimes there's good news, and I'm really happy to share good news. Occasionally there's some coming today, thankfully. And there are good things happening with people coming to Christ. The gathering is in full force, and the Lord really is extending his arms to all people. And this is a wonderful thing to see. We do see some revival kind of things, some renewed interest in the gospel and so on. Nevertheless, this is going on with 18 to 29-year-olds. Now, these are, as we have said for years, this is the group that are tomorrow's leaders. This is the group that's going to be sort of running the world, so to speak. And 41% found it either somewhat or completely acceptable to kill the CEO of an organization that you don't like, some kind of institution that you don't like. So anyway, this has been in the news for good reason, frankly, that there is this support for the suspected cold-blooded killer of this CEO. Now, a lot of people have commented on this, and some people say, well, our young people are more and more being taught in our educational systems, not even waiting for the university, although the universities seem to be a more obvious hotbed of this kind of thought, but have been taught to really decry and look down on and despise the basic institutions of society. And this is what you get. Then you get these attitudes. If you try to tear things down, right? And frankly, all of this is kind of neo-Marxist at its roots. We've talked about this so much, and this is an antichrist doctrine. This is completely against the doctrine of Christ. And this is all about the liberation theology, which is that anybody who's oppressed means that there's an oppressor, or anybody who's having a hard time in life, it's because somebody took it from you, or somebody else is having a good time. So there's this sort of neo-Marxist bias against people who are successful or who are in charge and things like that. So you preach this again and again and again, and what does it do? Well, we've got to destroy the institutions. We've got to knock down those people who are successful in society. Now, I remember reading about George Orwell. Actually, it was Jordan Peterson who was doing a lecture on George Orwell. And you may know that George Orwell wrote that pretty famous book, I hope it's still being read in schools, although I'm not sure anymore, but called Animal Farm, where it talks about some of the ills of socialism and so on. And it was a pretty iconic book. But one of the things that attracted him to socialism when he was a young man or a young adult was this idea of loving the poor and egalitarianism and whatever. And that can be a very seductive idea, that we want to stand up for the oppressed. Well, yes, Jesus Christ asks us to help the poor. In fact, it's a commandment. And it's a huge factor in the final judgment as to how did we treat the people who didn't have things in this life. Did we help? Did we reach out? Were we generous with what we had and what we've been given by God? And that's a beautiful thing, but it can so easily be twisted into not just loving the poor, but hating the rich. And that's what George Orwell apparently came to, because as he traveled in the Eastern Bloc and he saw what socialism was doing, that was the conclusion he came to, that Marxism, socialism, and so on was not really about loving the poor. It was just about hating the rich. And I think we can see that in our society. I think we can see that especially with the universities, and we can see it with what's happening to our children, even before that, sometimes in K through 12, but then particularly it's one of the themes of so many university experiences. So, brothers and sisters, let's just talk about this for a minute. There's something we call the transfer of values, and that needs to be intergenerational. We need to transfer values from one generation to the next if we want society to continue. And you can see the failure of that. In many instances, sometimes it's very obvious. For instance, we see that the people of King Benjamin were fully converted, probably sanctified. And then what happens? Several chapters later, it reports that there was the next generation who were too young to remember King Benjamin's speech. They were alive, but they were too young at the time King Benjamin's speech was given. And they grew up and they did not embrace the gospel. Now, again, let's not throw all parents under the bus, because there are a lot of forces. We're going to talk about that in a second. But I do want to say that parents still have a huge role. And sometimes we don't know how to fulfill that role. And it's really important that we cultivate a positive relationship with our children. Now, that doesn't mean we spoil them rotten. In fact, honestly, they have very little respect for parents who give them everything. And that's well documented. But as we teach them, as they're growing up, we protect them. As we teach them, I hope we're teaching them, we need to talk about not just good manners or how to succeed at school. We need to talk to them about our values. We need to talk to them about the Church of Jesus Christ and what the church teaches us and what a gift it is to have in our lives, about the gospel of Jesus Christ, about the saving principles and ordinances. I hope we talk with our children about these things regularly, and that everything is within the framework of the gospel of Jesus Christ. When they have questions, how hard is it to say, like, well, let's think about what Jesus Christ would do, or what God teaches us about this, or what do the scriptures say? And we can check and we can do word searches. Everything is so easy these days. We can Google things and see what the church teaches about certain things, or what the doctrine is, and how to explain it. Now it's easier than ever before. And how many times now has the church been emphasizing, more than ever before, although it's not really new, that the gospel teaching of our children needs to be home-centered and church-supported. It's not enough to say, well, we go to church every Sunday and our kids are getting taught in primary and Sunday school and young men's and young women's, and they'll be fine. No, it needs to be a part of the conversation of our homes. And if there are bad relationships between, if we get too angry at our children, if we're too impatient, if there's too much negativity in our homes, guess what? They're not going to care what we think. So all of this is connected to building that positive, safe relationship with our children, which does not mean permissive. Okay, I'm going to quote from Dr. Michael Schluter, who's a British social thinker and social entrepreneur who founded Britain's Relationship Foundation Parenting Coalition. Anyway, the world's attention, says Dr. Schluter, in the last decade has been focused understandably on environmental sustainability. Now, okay, I don't totally agree with that. I do think that it's good for us to be good stewards over the world, but I don't think that the focus has been wise, and I think it's been rather arrogant to think that we can change the climate. I think that of course, the Lord has asked us again and again to be good stewards, and then to first of all worship Jesus Christ, and then the earth has enough, and to spare, that the earth has plenty for us if we follow the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ, in every land. Relatively little attention, says Dr. Schluter, is being paid to social sustainability, which refers to a society's capacity to maintain social capital, inter-ethnic harmony, community cohesion, and family integration, which are required to minimize conflict and ensure human well-being, including physical and psychological health. I'm going to read that again because that's a lot, but he's saying that little attention has been paid to social sustainability, which would be the intergenerational transfer of values, because that's the only thing that will sustain society. And he defines it as society's capacity to maintain inter-ethnic harmony. I mean, getting along with all kinds of people that are in a part of our society, community cohesion, and family integration, which are required to minimize conflict and ensure human well-being. In other words, we're not going to have crime-free communities just because we have more punishment. Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a law enforcement system. I support our law enforcement officers, and I'm very grateful for them. And I wish our judiciary worked better, but I think that historically we've had a pretty good system in this country. It might be falling apart around the as prophesied, but as long as we can, let's try to maintain that. But this is the way to minimize conflict, is to transfer values. But we've got 41% of 18 to 29-year-olds who think it's okay to do that it's acceptable to shoot down somebody who runs an organization that you don't like. I would say we're losing the battle. The values needed to ensure strong and positive relationships in families and communities, and more widely in society, are easily recognized and defined by reference to the world's great religions. What a shock. They include compassion, responsibility. Now, responsibility is an anti-Marxist idea, because the Marxist idea is that you're not responsible. If you're oppressed or you don't have as much as you want, it's somebody else's fault. That's the opposite of the doctrine of Christ, which tells us that we all fall short of the glory of God, and we all have need to improve, to repent, to grow, to change, to become. Compassion, responsibility, faithfulness, kindness, generosity, humility, mercy, and self-control. Does that describe our college students these days? I hope it describes some of the college students that we know. Hopefully the ones from your family, the ones from my family. But does it describe our growing generation? Those words, compassion. Think about the protests that have been on campus that have been anti-Semitic, and other, kind of craziness that's been going on. If you ever watch those man on the street interviews for campus, that are on a campus, and they ask them questions about stuff. I mean, maybe they're just choosing the horrible ones, but brothers and sisters, it's scary. Faithfulness, kindness, generosity, humility. That's a big one that you can see lacking too often. Mercy and self-control. That's conquering the natural man. But what do we have lately? We have all kinds of campaigns for things like, it's not my fault, it's somebody else's fault, I deserve, I am entitled to, I should have, without having to generate responsibility or self-control. By the same token, a society needs to reject violence, vengeance, greed, cruelty, and self-centeredness. All natural man characteristics. So how does this done? Well, honestly, the family is always number one. The family is always number one in transferring the values, but that's contingent on having that positive relationship. Like building a relationship where our kids care what we think. I've said this before, but I learned a long time ago that it's not really about control, even with young children, although there are times where you have to like keep them safe and hold them back or stop them from doing something dangerous. But it's really about influence. And that happens by helping to transfer these values so that they learn to self-regulate. Because as I've said so many times, long before they're bigger than we are, they're faster than we are. So there needs to be an appropriate parental authority that is not frightening and scary and mean, but that is respected, where we do control the resources and we use them appropriately to incentivize. Now, you've known this, I've said this many times, but there are 3 parenting videos on Patreon that are easy to find. You just do a search, and they're videos that I've put on that platform that talk about parenting. And there's a lot of content on there that goes right along with helping our children inculcate these values and how to help us do that as parents. It's not rocket science, brothers and sisters, but it is a mystery in today's world. We've got all this free-range parenting and gentle parenting and all that stuff, and frankly, most of it is garbage. There's a lot of parenting content out there that is not helpful, and a lot of philosophies that are really just figure it out by themselves kind of stuff. There's no evidence to support that, and we have a ton of evidence to support the opposite. And then the educational system. And again, how are we going to influence them if the schools have more authority? So how do we do that? We talk about those things and we get involved and we see what's going on in the schools. And it's been wonderful to see more parents at school board meetings and so on in certain areas trying to get more involved with so much of the indoctrination that's happening in our schools about sex and gender, and Planned Parenthood has been in the schools forever. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of stuff happening in the schools that we need to be aware of and then protect our children from, whatever form that ends up taking. And as I said, universities particularly, I hope our kids are resistant to Marxism as they grow up, because we have talked with them about this Antichrist liberation theology, and we pointed out to them how contrary that is to what God offers us, the chance to become like him. If you're always blaming somebody else, that's never going to happen. We're never going to be able to fulfill the measure of our creation or become what we have the potential to become. Discipline, Dr. Schluter says, plays a vital role in transmitting values. It is the parent's special task to define for a child what constitutes good and bad. A child's conscience is trained inevitably by interaction with wider society, but parents have the primary opportunity and responsibility to focus and hone that understanding. Okay, so some bad news there, brothers and sisters, but the good news is God has given parents this incredibly important role. And again, this isn't about blaming parents when their kids grow up and make other decisions. This is not about that. As I have said so many times, if we judge the parent by the outcome of our children, then God himself would stand condemned. He has a lot of children who have rejected him. He's had a lot of children who are doing some pretty horrible things. And that's not how we define God. And it's not how we should define ourselves. That's ridiculous. They do have agency. And these are the last days. And quoting from Hugh Nibley, I've quoted before, some children in this life are going to be so bombarded with troubled ideologies and other substances and so on that they will not have a full opportunity to express the desires of their heart. And they will get that opportunity before it's over. Sometime in the probationary period, whether that's in the millennium or in the spirit world or whatever, they will have an opportunity to truly express the desires of their heart with their eyes wide open. So trust in that. The product of parenting, I say this all the time, is not the child. The product of parenting is the parent. So take heart and become a better parent at whatever stage you are, and learn how that can be done. God wants this to be a success story. He wants us to become better parents at, again, whatever stage of life we're in. So We can pray and receive promptings and guidance about how to do that and how to be available for hopefully the transmission of values throughout our lives, at whatever level that is. Parenting changes, obviously, when our children are grown up, and there's a shift, and we can't, insist on some things, of course, without damaging the relationship. So it's not about that, but it is about learning what we can do at whatever stage, and the Spirit will help us with that. God wants that to happen. He is on our side. So, okay, learn how to be a better parent wherever you are. Now, here's some good news. Bible sales across a variety of editions rose 22% in the U.S. through the end of October 2024. 22% Bible sales increased. And this is compared with the same period last year, according to a book tracker. This is despite nearly a third of U.S. adults identifying as religiously unaffiliated. So good news, bad news there for a moment. But the good news is Bible sales are up, and many people have weighed in on why, but it does seem like people are looking for meaning in life, and this is the world's bestseller, right? So maybe they're saying, like, I'm going to find out what's there. There are more people in the public scene who are known, who have been unapologetic about their belief in Jesus Christ or their reading of the Bible, and they're trusting in the wisdom that God has shared through his prophets throughout time. So that's the good news, is that while evil is flagrant and it seems like Satan has his day as the god of this world, there is the Spirit working on people who are open and who have an honest heart. And that's good news. We are seeing the outreach continue of the Spirit to all God's children. And we should be grateful for that and hopefully be part of that groundswell. Okay, Section 1 of the D&C, we're just going to give you a little background, and we'll get into more of this in Part 2. How far do I want to go with this? Not too far before we shift to Part 2. But anyway, this is what it says about the D&C online on the website. The Lord gave divine guidance to the prophet Joseph Smith regarding the restoration of the gospel. And that's what we have in the D&C. We have guidance given to Joseph Smith to restore the gospel of Jesus Christ into the institution of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I've often described it this way, that this is kind of the tutorial of Joseph Smith and the early church leaders. Some of them received specific instruction, as we're going to see. And maybe this is multiple times through the D&C for you. Maybe it's the first time through. Either way, it just gets better and better. I think some of the early chapters, some people get a little discouraged because there's a lot of organizational stuff going on. I should say the early sections. But as we go further, there is rich doctrine in the D&C. I've mentioned that this is the first book of Scripture that I read on my own. When I was a seminary student, I was 16, and this was the book we were studying. And for the first time, I decided to read through the whole thing. In itself, motivated. I mean, again, it wasn't like a chart we were following in our class, but it was just this study subject. And I thought, I'm going to read it. And so I decided to read every day until I finished it and fell in love with the Doctrine and Covenants. I learned a ton now, and here I am saying all the time how grateful I am for my parents who taught me the gospel and how open they were with discussing gospel principles and the plan of salvation and everything, and I'm so indebted to them for that. But there are some things that you only learn when you read them for yourself, and that's what happened to me. I learned things that maybe my parents had mentioned. Maybe we hadn't gotten to those details, but it was revealed in this great book as I went through and read it for myself, and I have been in love with this book ever since. It's also something that I think helps to increase our gratitude for Joseph Smith. So here is the tutorial of Joseph Smith. That's what the D&C is to me. It shows how God worked with him to reveal the things that we needed to establish the church organization and to understand some of the profound doctrines of the gospel. Many of these revelations were written down by scribes, typically on loose sheets of paper, and were later copied and bound into books. In November 1831, the prophet Joseph and other church leaders met in a conference of the elders in Hiram, Ohio. Now, the first section is section 2, chronologically, right? And that was given in September of 1823. That's the first recorded revelation to Joseph Smith. Now, he talks about the first vision, of course, and we have a record of that in the Joseph Smith history. But as far as the revelations of the Doctrine and Covenants goes, section 2 is the earliest chronological section. This section 1 was given by Revelation as a foreword to the Book of Commandments, which is the early name for the D&C. So in 1831, so that's 8 years later, the prophet was meeting with some elders in Hiram, Ohio, and during this time, the church leaders decided to compile and publish a number of the revelations that Joseph had received that had been written on these loose papers all over the place. I mean, they've been keeping track of them, but they weren't put together for the members to have access to. So they decided to do that and to call it the Book of Commandments. William W. Phelps had been called as a printer into the church. And so copies of the Revelation were delivered to him in Independence, Missouri, to be printed. The publication was nearly complete in July of 1833, so that's not quite 2 years after they decided to do this project, when a mob attacked Phelps' print shop and destroyed the entire building, and the printing press, and many of the printed sheets of the Revelations. Several individuals, including 2 young women, and we have their names, Mary Elizabeth Rollins and her sister Caroline, were able to save some of the printed pages. And though it was incomplete, because some of them were destroyed, a small number of copies of the book were eventually bound. So it was, the Lord does allow the adversary to hinder the work. And many of us have felt that when we're trying to do good, when we're trying to make improvements in our lives, sometimes we really feel the power of the adversary working against us. And that is a part of this life, is to recognize that while he does have power, the adversary has power on this earth, that ultimately God prevails. And that if we join ourselves to the work and trust in God, that eventually the victory will come. In the meantime, that's part of what we deal with in the spiritual weight room that helps build muscle, is that we don't succumb to the efforts of the adversary. We acknowledge them, we recognize them, but we don't fear. We continue. And we know and trust that God will prevail. Later in 1835, a second compilation of the Revelations was received and published and called the Doctrine and Covenants. So the book title happened in 1835. This edition contained 103 revelations and a preface, and also included were the lectures on faith. I don't know how many of you have read the lectures on faith. I loved them. I read them when I was like 18, and I really learned some wonderful things from those School of the Prophets lessons. I, at the time, thought that Joseph Smith had written them all, but apparently Sidney Rigdon was a teacher too, and it's not really specified, but there are beautiful teachings in that volume, the Lectures on Faith, which now is separate. But it was included in that original version of the D&C. The first time it was called, the second version, that was called the Doctrine and Covenants for the first time. The Lectures on Faith are 7 theological lectures given to the School of the Prophets during the winter of 1834 and 35. The first edition was organized in 2 parts. Part 1 was the doctrine, and then that included the Lectures on Faith, and Part 2, the Covenants and Commandments, which were revelations that had been received to that point. The lectures on faith were omitted in the 1921 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. So that's when they took them out. And subsequent editions, because they were theological lectures or lessons that were not given as revelations to the church. But it's still a valuable volume. If you want to go look that up, it's a quick read. As later editions of the Doctrine and Covenants were printed, new revelations have been added, and these editions include slight changes to how the revelations were organized. In 1981, the church published a new English language edition of the Triple Combination, which of course is what many of us use now, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price, with Joseph Smith's 1836 vision added and President Joseph F. Smith's 1918 vision of the redemption of the dead added as sections 137 and 138. And I remember that time because if we were old enough, we remember that the church, by unanimous sustaining vote, accepted those new sections of the D&C as canonized scripture. And they presented them as a sustaining opportunity in General Conference. I actually remember that. And then 2 official declarations were also added: the Manifesto, which was by President Wilford Woodruff, announcing that the practice of plural marriage was to be discontinued, and also an announcement by the First Presidency of a revelation received by President Kimball extending the priesthood and temple blessings to all worthy male members. So those were added at that time as well. Now, Section 1 was given by revelation to Joseph Smith, and we're going to get into that in Part 2 and start talking about what this section contains and some of the great wording and messages that are there. So I hope you'll join me for that. Brothers and sisters, check out the parenting videos. Share them with your kids if you have grown kids, with their own children or with friends or neighbors. Don't be obnoxious about it. Brothers and sisters, there is a parenting crisis in the country. Permissive parenting has done tons of damage. Most of these new age parenting approaches have huge flaws in them. There may be some good ideas, but they also, in many respects, are very flawed. And I would encourage you to talk to your children now about parenting. Even if you have young children, brothers and sisters, I'm not talking about tiny ones, but I'm talking about school-age kids. They hear a lot about what the parents are doing of their friends. And it's great to give them the principles of parenting that I share in those videos that the gospel teaches us, because it's never too soon for them to think about how they are being parented, how their friends are being parented, and how they want to prepare to share their values intergenerationally with their own children when the time comes. Let's do it, brothers and sisters. Let's take it up a notch this new year. Let's get closer to Zion. Let's build the kingdom. Let's choose glory. As ever, thanks to my husband, Chris Anderson, and Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care.